Fresh out the oven, it's Cinema Bums. I'm Wade.
And I'm Emmett.
Cinema Bums is a podcast where we watch through every single movie in popular film franchises, one each week, to try and track how the storytelling in the series changes over time. Today we are starting our brand new mini-series, X23, where we are going to watch every single film in the longest running and least coherent cinematic universe, Fox's X-Men universe. We're going to fully spoil the film we're talking about today, but we will not spoil any future entries in the series. Today we are talking about X-Men 2000. Emmett, let me ask you, I don't mean this in a shady way, but you picked this miniseries. You wanted to talk about the X-Men films.
Yes.
So what is it about these films that made you want to spend the next 13 weeks of our life watching them?
Well, these were my favorite, like some of my favorite movies growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And they were definitely my favorite superhero movies growing up. Specifically, I started watching them at a pretty young age, and they have been with me from then until now. They just keep making them. And they are weird in a way that I think the other superhero movies, while they're exciting and like have outlandish things happen in them, they're not just plain weird the way that X-Men are. I also think that as a young kid, the narrative of these kind of outsider superheroes who they're like really cool to them and to like the other mutants, but to the outside world, they're seen as a threat as opposed to like Superman or the Fantastic Four, people who are more widely regarded as like straight heroic. Mm-hmm. And I always thought that was just more rich territory.
Yeah.
Imagination wise.
I remember you saying when we first started talking about doing this series that you felt there was some value in these movies that was underappreciated.
Did I say that?
Yes, I remember you saying that the first time. I think there's also something to be said that in the future there will be not much reason for people to watch these movies. I'm not saying they're not good. I just mean it's kind of a closed book now on the series.
Sure.
So this movie that we're talking about today, X-Men, came out 20 years ago.
Yeah.
The most recent entry, the 13th and final entry in this series, came out 2 months ago as we record this. Came out this year, 2020. These films were previously produced by Fox, all of these series, and last year in 2019, the Disney Corporation bought Fox and is now going to fold future entries with the X-Men into their Marvel Cinematic Universe.
And that's another thing that I liked about the X-Men as the Marvel Cinematic Universe started to develop, is I liked that they were their own independent thing, and that each movie felt like it could really stand on its own, especially after the original trilogy. And so they weren't connected to other things. You didn't have to, like, I like some of the movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but I hate the idea that I have to watch Thor and Thor 2 to understand Thor Ragnarok. Like, that bums me out. That you have to like have all this backstory or watch like Captain America to understand what's going on in Infinity War. It's so like the idea that you have a series that is completely self-isolated and they're only under their own like flagship, it kind of I like that a little bit more.
Okay, so let me ask you, what was your first experience with the X-Men?
So my first experience was when the week that my little sister Mariah was born, in 2006, was the same week that X3: The Last Stand came out. And my cousin Charles was ferrying me back and forth between where my mom was in the hospital and like back at home where he was kind of like taking care of us. And on one of those road trips, he saw that X3 was in the theaters and he was an X-Men fan. So he was like, let's go watch this. I'd never seen any of the other ones. I had no idea what was going on, but I loved it. I was like, this is awesome. Who's the guy with the claws? I want to be him. I like styled my hair like that for a long time.
It's clarifying some things for me.
Yeah. For real. I was like always like trying to grow sideburns even into like early college, was like really wished that I could do the Wolverine sideburn thing. So then I was like, okay, well, I got to go back and watch the rest of them. So at that time, there were only two others. There was only X1 and X2 other than The Last Stand. And so I think Charles probably rented those for me or like got them for me on Netflix, and we watched them together. And then I was like, oh, okay, this makes more sense. And so that is, I don't specifically remember the first time I watched the first one, but I do remember like watching X3 in theaters and being blown away by it. What was your first experience with the series?
I think it was this movie. Mm-hmm. I have memories of how I felt about each of the first three movies. I don't have a specific memory of like when I saw this for the first time, but I think this was the first movie. I was a DC Comics kid growing up. I watched the DC movies. I mean, really before this, there weren't Marvel movies. Right. But I watched all of the DC movies my mom had shown to me growing up. I would watch the DC cartoons. So I was much more familiar with those characters than I was with any of the Marvel characters. I know my aunt was very into this movie. When I was growing up, my mom was very like aware, very concerned about what content I would watch, which was a worry that she passed on to me. I remember as a kid being like very aware of the content in movies. I would like read reviews or like read the ratings or stuff to like try and find out what was in movies, which I think backfired in some ways because I would always be like, well, this movie has graphic beheadings, I can't watch that. As like a child, I was 6 when this movie came out. So I remembered that I was very excited for it, and I wasn't allowed to watch it right when it came out. I definitely didn't see it in theaters. I remember specifically that it was like the bar scene that this movie like took place in, like a crazy bar with like a fight club. Like that was one of the things I remember my family talking about as a reason I couldn't see it. But I did read the novelization.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if you remember this. I don't think it's a thing anymore. But it used to be that like every movie that was geared even a little bit towards kids would have like a junior novelization, which was like 100 pages and had 8 pages of color photos in the middle.
I do, yeah.
And then they would also have an adult novelization. There would be 2 novelizations for each of these movies. And the adult one would be like 300 or 400 pages. It would be like a little airplane paperback. And my Aunt Maria had read the novelization, I think after seeing the movie, and gave it to me. So then eventually I watched it. My parents had a rule where like if there was a book, I had to read the book before I could see the movie.
Sure.
Which is funny, and now as an adult looking at it, that this is a movie based on a comic, and my first introduction to it was the novel explaining who the X-Men were. But I read like the adult novelization for this, and then at some point saw it, I think like in the lead up to X2.
Okay.
Okay, so this movie that we're talking about today is called just X-Men. It was written by David Hayter, who is most well known for being the actor who plays Solid Snake in Metal Gear Solid and Smash Bros.
Wait, what?
Directed by Bryan Singer, released on July 14th, 2000, running a blessed 1 hour and 44 minutes.
Yeah, it's nice.
Made for a budget of $75 million.
Okay.
And the formula for all these budgets is that however much they spend to make a movie, they normally spend that equal amount to market it. So as a general rule of thumb, a movie has to make twice its budget in order to break even for the studio. Okay. So this would have had to make $150 million.
Yeah,
it would have had to make
almost
$150 million
million. Sorry.
just to break even. It made $300 million. Yeah, so it was a hit. It was a pretty big hit that year. So Bryan Singer, before this movie even came out, and then again and again and again after this, has been accused of sexual misconduct, specifically with underage men. He had a lawsuit first in 1997, 3 years before this movie came out, and then again in 2014, 2017, and 2019. This was a thing where like people knew back then. Like it was an open secret.
Yeah.
Decades before Me Too.
Uh-huh.
And then really just in 2019 when it all came to a head is when Bryan Singer like just left for Thanksgiving and never came back to Bohemian Rhapsody.
Oh, wow.
Let's not forget that he was directing a Best Picture nominated film in 2019.
Good Lord.
22 years after these first accusations.
That's crazy.
I know this is a complicated question. Like, but I think it's good that we're dealing with this on the first movie we watch here.
Yeah.
Like, how do we handle looking back at this movie now, knowing like what its creator was allegedly doing at the time and continue to do for 20 years? What responsibility should the movie bear of that, if any?
I mean, I think that's a really loaded and like broad question of like how much can you separate the art from the artist?
Yeah.
How much can you separate, like, especially when it's the director of a film? Well, I have a tendency to say that, you know, it's good. We shouldn't let these people make any more movies. We shouldn't let people make more money and use their, like, market things with their name.
Yeah.
But it's also true that those movies exist, and those people are going to continue to watch those movies with or without knowledge of what's going on.
Yeah.
And so maybe having the knowledge of it and just holding on to that and carrying that with you while you watch it is, I don't know. It's tricky because I really do love this movie. And
yeah.
So I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was a very well spoken answer. I feel like there is no like hard and fast answer when it comes to this, like you said.
Yeah.
I think it is down to each person. I think that it just was something that was weighing a little heavier on me this watch, especially because I just noticed that there are like so many young men in this movie.
That's true.
I think this is kind of, and I'm not alleging misconduct here, but when I watch a Zack Snyder movie, it's really hard not to notice that like every bit role is played by a man who is the age and look of Zack Snyder. Like everyone looks just like him. And watching like this, I just couldn't help but notice that all of these small roles were being played by these like young, heartthrobby actors. And knowing that that's like where most of his misconduct came from, of him like promising roles in exchange for sexual favors and stuff like that. So I just thought that weighed a little heavy. I mean, I'm sure like watching this, like I didn't know about that when I watched this as a kid. I also thought that like in 20 years when we watch Avengers Endgame, probably like half of those people will be like, oh, they went on to do this terrible thing.
Sure.
You know, or even like, oh, something crazy was happening then.
And we didn't know about it.
No idea about. But yeah, that's not the last time we'll talk about Bryan Singer. But I just thought from the off, not to be a downer, but I feel like that is like an elephant in the room about this movie.
For sure.
And like the 3 movies in the series after this, he still gets to go on and direct.
Yeah.
Okay, well, moving right along. We like to ask a few questions about each of these movies we watch. And let me put the first one to you. X-Men 2000, flop or bop?
Well, all of that being said about Bryan Singer, I think he made a bop of a movie in this one. Like this is a fun movie. I think a very clear movie and like feels very human. Like the stakes are very real in this movie to me. And so it is it's like a superhero movie before we get all of the superhero movie tropes. It does have a lot of the superhero movie tropes in it, but it is not so like it feels like almost innocent of a lot of the superhero movie tropes that will come along later that I think to me like make later movies in the X-Men installments and also a lot of the Marvel Cinematic movies to me just feel like big but empty. And this one feels like it's about a small enough thing that you can wrap your head around it.
Yeah.
And it is, you know, I think it's enjoyable right up to the end. Yeah. How about you? Flop or bop?
Oh boy. I think that on this 2-point scale, where it's either a flop or a bop, I think for me personally, it's a flop.
Okay.
I felt for the first 2 acts that it was a bop.
Mm-hmm.
But like and when I say that, I thought that like there was more good than the bad.
Mm-hmm.
But then I would say after the last half an hour, I just felt that there was more bad than good.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are a lot of really smart narrative decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of decisions, if you're just staring at like the whole concept of the X-Men,
Mm-hmm.
which, and it's kind of hard to think about this now, but like they had never been on screen.
Well, they'd been on the TV screen.
Yeah, but not on a movie, not in live action.
Yeah.
And looking at that and being like, okay, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
With years and years and decades of history and all these different characters and scenarios. Mm-hmm. I think like the way they anchor us with these 2 lead characters, these 2 audience ciphers of Rogue and Wolverine is so smart. Mm-hmm. I think it really clearly shows the way the world works and the history of it in such smart ways. At the same time, I think that it's hard watching this movie now to separate it from the decade of bad cinema we get because of it. The decisions in this that lead to us having to go through that with everything else. Like, I feel like this movie is the reason why we don't get anything comics accurate until like 2012. I feel like this is why everything feels like it has to be like a little more grounded. Mm-hmm. That's something, the grounded thing I think works for this movie. The like straying from the comic accurate thing, I think dates it now more than it would if they had just gone for it. But it's hard for me to separate it from that and to separate it kind of from the sins of Bryan Singer. Mm-hmm. And I just did not think the third act worked.
Okay.
Like, I think the third act just goes for too long into punching and kicking, and the punching and kicking does not look good now.
That is true. The fights are definitely dated now. So it's interesting you bring up about the like changing from the comics so much, because my question to you would then be, where would you start otherwise? Because the X-Men, as we know, have been running since 1963, September 1963, X-Men 1, and has been continuously running since then. So it had been running for 37 years at the point that this movie came out. It has now been running for 57 years.
That's wild.
It's crazy to think about. So these comics were created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. Jack Kirby was the first artist and co-writer, and Stan Lee was the writer. These comics go through so many different iterations and storylines and like resets on timelines and flag and like who's running the team and which characters are dead. Character death and resurrection happens all the time. Another interesting fact is the main character of this movie is Wolverine, right? Would you agree? Or at least one of the 2 main characters.
I would agree. I'm glad that you said that because I had that thought too. I know that we had talked before going into this that in both of our memories, it felt like Rogue could be the main character.
Yeah.
And I was surprised by how little she's really in it for how much I remember this being her movie.
I do think, it's like her and Wolverine.
Yeah,
and like it's about their relationship in a lot of ways, like
a
lot of the movie is. But I do think he's the main character. Wolverine didn't show up in Marvel Comics. His first issue appeared in 1974.
Wow!
And the first comic that he showed up in was the Incredible Hulk, number 181 or 180 and 181. He shows up as an enemy of the Hulk, so he's not even in the X-Men run originally. And I do not have here when he eventually joins the X-Men. But he is a much later, I mean, that's already 11 years later before he even exists as a character. He quickly became like one of everybody's favorite characters, but he is not a part of the original team. And that's kind of what this movie is about too. It's like how Wolverine joined the X-Men is like I mean, not exactly, but it is like the origin story of how Wolverine became a part of that.
Yeah, I do think of Wolverine as like the X-Men.
Right.
He's kind of like the breakout character, and he was the one who was like one of the Avengers.
Mm-hmm.
He was the one who would always team up with Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he was the one who was most out and in the rest of the Marvel universe.
Mm-hmm.
From what I remember from like the comics and games I read as a kid, I do wonder how much of that was happening prior to like this movie.
A lot of that was.
Okay.
So he has showed up across Spider-Man comics, the Avengers, Fantastic Four. He has a thing with the Thing from.
He has a thing with
the Thing, like a competitive thing with the Thing.
A competitive thing.
Yeah, a competitive thing. You know, he's from Canada.
Mm-hmm.
He's Canadian, and they're always like cracking jokes about him being a Canadian, and I'm sure that they get into fistfights. I mean, pretty much, if you can picture a big, strong character from any of the Marvel comics, Wolverine at some point had a beef with that guy.
Yeah.
Like, Wolverine at some point was like going up against that guy because they pissed him off somehow. But I just want to get into the cultural context also on like what other movies came out that year.
Yeah, let's hear it.
The highest grossing films of 2000.
Okay.
We already said that X-Men got almost 300 million. But the highest grossing, in order of the highest grossing from 1 to 10, Mission Impossible 2.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Gladiator, which also won Best Picture and Best Actor in the Academy Awards.
Wow.
Castaway. What Women Want, starring Mel Gibson.
What could women want more than Mel Gibson?
Right.
Talk about not aging well.
Dinosaur. Which was also the most expensive movie of that year. And, obviously performed pretty well because it comes in number 5.
Wow.
How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Meet the Parents. The Perfect Storm. X-Men at number 9. And What Lies Beneath at number 10. And the most critically acclaimed movies of that same year are Gladiator, like we said, Traffic, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, American Psycho, Almost Famous, and Aaron Brockovich.
It was interesting to me hearing that, like, how many of those movies were like for adults, and how many of them were just like where the pitch is like an actor does an adult thing. You know, like, that is truly wild to me. I mean, Gladiator was number 2. That's like a film rated R.
Yeah.
And it's like now, like, if an R-rated film is in the top 10, that's an insane thing.
Really?
Like, yeah, because movies are for like families and teenagers and children.
Yeah, all of those except for like How the Grinch Stole Christmas and Dinosaur. Basically,
which are the two of these I remember seeing in theaters distinctly. Both terrified me. Yeah, so that is really interesting to me. I feel like that feels so different from what like a top selling movies today would be. I noticed a couple similarities to other movies of the late 90s and early thousands in this that I would just like to mention now while we're here.
Okay.
The DNA opening credits.
Okay.
Which was such a thing.
It was.
It's so weird. The thing where we like go into the bloodstream as like the music is playing. I don't know. I think Fight Club is the earliest popular example of this. I don't know if there are earlier examples.
Okay.
That obviously came out in 99, which was the year before this.
Yeah.
I wrote Politics, so big in 2000.
Yeah.
Also thinking about Star Wars Episode 1, which came out a year before this.
Yeah,
which I know that Bryan Singer went to the set of to like learn how to use visual effects.
Oh, well.
Both of these movies feature like long scenes of the Senate talking about things.
Yes, although I think it's handled a lot better in this movie. I have a little quote from Stan Lee about why, like, when he was creating the X-Men, like, you know, he'd created already like Thor and the Avengers and the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and Iron Man. He'd already done all of those. And he said, this is a quote from 2004. He said, "I couldn't have everybody bitten by a radioactive spider or exposed to a gamma ray explosion, and I took the cowardly way out. I said to myself, why don't I just say they're mutants? They were born that way."
In your research, did you find anything talking about its origin being like explicitly a civil rights metaphor, being from the 60s?
They haven't said.
I think Stan Lee is also Jewish, so I know there's a lot of stuff in there.
They talk about how there's it's not explicitly, or nowhere did I find that they talked about it being explicitly about that, but it is said that, you know, they explore themes of racism, anti-Semitism, and especially homophobia, especially in the sense that,
especially in these movies,
and
certainly.
especially in these movies, it's in the sense that the mutants, like a lot of the mutants, are trying to hide that they're mutants from other people. It's interesting. They said they fought for justice and equality for mutants. Is like how they described the original X team, is that they did that. They've said that it wasn't initially meant to be this way, but later on people have compared Charles Xavier and Magneto to kind of being corollaries to MLK and Malcolm X, in the sense that one is preaching for love and acceptance into the dominant culture, and the other is talking about war against. And I think in this movie he even says, by any means necessary. Magneto does. Although I don't think those corollaries work exactly in terms of like the racial history in the United States, but they are interesting to think about and explore.
Not like a one for one. We
Yeah.
obviously also know that those leaders flip-flopped towards the end of their lives.
For
but
sure.
yeah, I think that is a big thing. It's obviously made textual in this film,
Right.
with the by any means necessary. But the idea of like these two old friends who both want the exact same thing, and just that one of them says like, they use violence against us, we can use violence against them,
Right.
and the other one says like, we have to be the better person, we have to be above it. Yeah, I mean, I think we see that dynamic again and again in superhero movies after this too, but
For
I
sure.
do think it works really well. As we'll talk about a little later, I know that it was one of the keys to unlocking like what they were going to do with this movie.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, I also wanted to say the other like 90s thing that I noticed on this watch was the body horror, which is a big thing, and like the Cronenberg movies and like The Fly being mainstream. Like people were really into the body horror, and you've got it here with the Senator Kelly like
Oh yeah,
shifting through the bars and then like melting and turning into a puddle of water.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that part is really gruesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it freaked me out as a kid.
The part that I remember most from when I was a kid is like when he comes back on the beach and he's like starts off as like a fish man and then turns into human and he's naked, like naked and veiny walking through the beach. I remember that, leaving an imprint as a child for sure. So I want to talk about the history of the superhero movie.
Yes.
While we're here. I just want to say this right now that I'm not trying to mansplain the next thing I say, because I'm sure this will be common knowledge to some people.
Okay.
But in talking about this movie, a lot of people came to me and said like, oh, cool, you're talking about DC movies first. So as a result of some of the stuff we're going to talk about, the Marvel Comics characters got like split up in film.
Right.
But the X-Men are and always have been a part of the Marvel universe. Like in the comics, like the X-Men and Spider-Man and the Avengers are all in the same world.
Yes.
They interact together. They've like all been together from the start. So I just want to say that up front. This is one of the very first Marvel movies.
Okay.
So on screen, it's mostly like the domain of DC in terms of just like the big screen.
Right, because you got Superman and Batman.
Yeah, Superman the movie comes out in 1978, greenlit mostly off of the success of Star Wars, but that becomes like a big hit and is like a seminal classic too, like critically acclaimed. That was the first superhero thing I remember. My mom went through like a classics phase where she was going to show me all of the classics, and we watched Superman the movie. Then we get Batman '89 and all of the Batman movies, which are like hugely popular.
Right.
And at this time there was really like no Marvel comic stuff on film. There was a little on the silver screen. In the 70s there were these Incredible Hulk TV show and TV movies that my mom loved growing up. There were some for Doctor Strange too. But in terms of like movies, there wasn't really anything going on. And then in 1997, there's Batman and Robin, which is like regarded as having killed the superhero movie by being so bad. I want to say I watched it recently for the first time in my life, having been told my entire life that it was like the worst movie ever made. And I think you guys are crazy. But it is true that there was like a huge critical and public backlash to that movie that had been kind of brewing. A lot of this is tied into the Batman series because Batman 89 is a huge hit. Batman Returns, people say it's too dark for their kids, for a movie primarily aimed at kids. That's a conversation that was happening at the same time with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as well. So then in Batman and Robin in 1997, if you don't know, it's the one with George Clooney. It's the one where he uses the Bat credit card and where everyone has nipples on their bat suit, and it starts with like a close-up montage of the butts of the Batmen. That's a movie that is like explicitly homoerotic, as an interesting parallel to this movie, which is very much like a queer narrative, but isn't really visually homoerotic at all. No. I wouldn't even say visually erotic in much of a way for as many like hot young movie stars wearing tight leather as it has.
Yeah.
There is like, I guess, a commendable restraint. So that movie comes out in 1997, and everyone always talks about how it killed the superhero movie. And then this movie comes out 3 years later. So I think at times I could be dismissive of this. Like, well, it killed it for what, 3 years? Yeah. But it is true that it killed that type of superhero movie. Because you have kind of that like huge neon excess of Batman and Robin.
Right.
And superhero movies do come back 3 years later, but when they come back, the first scene is the Holocaust. So I think that it does like kill that like grandeur of the superhero movie for a long time, where like now superheroes have to be like a little more adult, a little bit aged up. They have to deal with real world issues in a more explicit way. I would be remiss not to note too Blade, which came out in 1998.
Okay.
That obviously is like an R-rated horror movie, but that is a Marvel movie. It's like the first Marvel movie. It's also like the first black superhero movie. A lot of times people say like X-Men is the start of the superhero movie reemergence. It's the start of the Marvel movies. Or they'll say like Black Panther is the first movie ever made about a black superhero. All of that stuff belongs to Blade.
Okay.
Which comes out 2 years before this. Shows, I think that there is like an audience for adults watching like older takes on superhero stuff. So this comes out in 2000 and then ushers in like Spider-Man and all the sequels and all that stuff. We'll talk about more as the series goes on in terms of like what's going on at the same time. So that is, I think, part of why the tone of this movie is what it is.
Yeah, it does not feel like a kid's movie.
Yeah, I would agree.
It feels like it's like it could be a movie for teens. But like looking back on it, I'm like, why did I like that movie that much when I was a kid? Like it's like pretty dark, and it's also pretty like muted in some ways. And like which I like about it now, in comparison to a lot of like the later stage MCU stuff, and especially in comparison to the later stage X-Men stuff. But it is like toned down. It is like grittier than I think of it being like, if I was viewing it just through the lens of history, I would be like, yeah, that was, it's X-Men. It's not that, not that dark, not that gritty, but this one does feel like more lived in, I guess.
This is all a result of the comics industry too. So the 90s were a really tough time for Marvel Comics specifically. In 1992, 7 of their like most famous creators very publicly left the company and went and formed Image.
Oh yeah,
which is kind of like the third pillar. There's like Marvel, DC, and Image is like very much the third one there. And their big thing is that like all of the properties there are creator owned.
Okay,
so it's not just like like anyone can write a Batman thing.
Okay,
it's not like Bob Kane and Bill Finger and their estates have to like forever sign off on what happens to Batman.
Okay.
And there were just like 7 like really high profile creators led by Todd McFarlane who were just like sick of not really and Rob Liefeld not like having ownership over their work.
Wow.
Who left, and that caused like a further big crash in all of the Marvel sales.
Damn.
In 1996, the then parent company for Marvel files for bankruptcy. So they were like about to shut down.
Damn.
And that's when Marvel starts selling up its movie rights for any possible cash.
Damn.
We've all been here when you start looking at the things in your room a little bit differently. You're like, how much would this get at GameStop?
Yeah.
How much would this get on eBay? That was Marvel in the lead up to this movie. They're looking around the room, putting out feelers like, you guys want the X-Men? You guys want Spider-Man?
Mm-hmm.
And this is how... Obviously, Columbia Pictures and Sony get the rights to Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm.
Paramount gets the rights to The Incredible Hulk. Fox gets the rights to X-Men. And then all of that stuff results in these splintered universes. And, you know, I think it is worth saying, too, that in those DC movies, it wasn't like they were connected. Like, the DC movies who had total creative control also didn't adapt them to be like... This is Superman, he lives in the same world as Batman.
Right.
Which is what the comics for both companies always have been.
Right.
They were trying to make this movie for a really long time.
Okay. How long?
Well, in 1990, Orion Pictures was working on it. It was working on a version of an X-Men movie. It was going to be directed by Catherine Bigelow.
Okay.
It was going to be produced by James Cameron. It was going to have Angela Bassett as Storm.
Oh, my God.
And Bob Hoskins as Wolverine.
Who the hell is Bob Hoskins?
He's the guy from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He's Mario from Super Mario Bros.
Oh, Jesus.
I mean, it's pretty silly, but he is kind of the body type for Wolverine. That is a thing, too, that when this movie came out, there was a little bit of controversy with Wolverine, because Wolverine in the comics is a very short guy.
Yeah, he is like a short, like stocky guy, and Hugh Jackman is not.
He's
that.
like stocky, he's a little bit bigger, he's very hairy, and he's very short. And that's like the thing of his character, is that he's supposed to be like a feral Wolverine. So they were trying to make that version of the movie, and it just didn't get off the ground in time because the rights reverted back in 1992.
Okay.
And then in 1994, Laura Schuler Donner, who is a very famous producer. She's the wife of Richard Donner, who directed all of the original Superman movies.
Oh, okay.
Also directed Lethal Weapon. She has produced a lot of stuff. She takes control of the rights.
Okay.
At this point, everyone you can imagine who is big at this time, every writer you can think of and every director you can think of is like courted or does a pass on it. And every single actor you can imagine is considered for Wolverine and Storm, who, going back to 1990, are considered like the two leads of this movie. It's like the two things you got to get right are Wolverine and Storm, which is interesting because in this movie, Storm doesn't speak until 48 minutes in.
Jesus, it's true. It's she really gets done dirty in this movie.
Are those like the two leads of the comics?
Well, she did definitely. Storm led the X-Men for a while. She was a team leader on one of the runs of the X-Men for a long time, and she is a major character throughout that. In fact, the interesting tidbit, Storm, in one of the runs, she is Queen of Wakanda and the wife of the Black Panther, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
But she is like a fairly major character and eventually is one of the main people leading the team. But, as we say, not in this movie hardly at all, even though we have Halle Berry playing her finally, and she's... I mean, I feel like Halle Berry would be a great choice to play her if there was anything to play in this movie.
She feels a little shackled by that accent, too.
Yeah, that is a little strange.
I would say, though, that I feel like we get about an equal amount of all of, like, the X-Men who aren't Professor X. Like, I would say we actually get... She obviously talks less in the first... I mean, she doesn't talk in the first half.
Yeah.
But I would say in terms of screen time, it feels pretty equal with Cyclops, Storm, and Jean Grey.
That's
They're
fair.
all kind of not really there and also there in the background for a lot of it.
That's true, yeah.
Oh, so just some of the ones that I wanted to mention.
Okay.
Joss Whedon did a pass on the script.
Oh, damn.
That was thrown out for being too like light and funny and irreverent.
Good.
Michael Chabon, I don't know how you say it, but the fiction writer, novelist, did a pass on it too. Brett Ratner, who ends up being the director for 3, was assigned to it. Robert Rodriguez and Paul W.S. Anderson. Paul W.S. Anderson, who is off of Mortal Kombat and
Okay.
Resident Evil was kind of like the video game movie guy.
Okay.
All of them were attached to it for some time, or they were trying to get those guys. Eventually, they bring on Bryan Singer, who is coming off the success of The Usual Suspects. Have you seen that?
I have.
Did you like it?
I did.
Yeah, I liked it too. And that was like a cult hit at the time, very critically acclaimed. This is like an interesting early example of them bringing on an indie director to do a superhero movie, which becomes the norm after. But at this point, it was like, even someone like more like Catherine Bigelow, like an action director is who you would get.
Okay, I see.
Like, or Paul W.S. Anderson, like somebody who has done that genre of films is who you would get for it.
Right.
Whereas like now the status quo is you do like one or two critically acclaimed indie movies and then you get to do a Marvel movie.
Right.
Like straight away. And that is what this guy was doing too, but what was definitely like not the norm at that point.
Well, they're growing Marvel movies on a tree at this point. So like they're just handing them out to anybody who asks.
I don't know why we haven't asked.
Right?
So he comes on in 1996. It doesn't like get going right away. That's obviously 4 years before the movie comes out. So he goes off to shoot another movie, which is called Apt Hotel, which is headed by Ian McKellen.
Oh, okay.
Which is where he meets McKellen. They're working on trying to get the script right. The famous X-Men writer Chris Claremont in 1997 hears that the movie has stalled and sends them like a manifesto that is like his list of like what makes the X-Men unique, what makes them different from the other teams, what the core tenets of the team are and what they stand for. And that like gets production back on track. And then in 1998, they turn in the draft that becomes the basis for this movie. And like they have said that the key to unlocking it was focusing on the Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm X dynamic.
Okay. Gotcha.
Of Professor X and Magneto. In the original script, that draft that got cut from the movie for budget concerns, Beast, Nightcrawler, Pyro, and the Danger Room.
Oh, come on.
The Danger Room is in X-Men lore like basically a training simulator room. It's a room where they go and like fight a bunch of people, and then it's revealed that it's like all a safe sim inside their house.
Right.
But that was also in a lot of the drafts. Like tons of the drafts were just like all about the Danger Room. People were so excited by that concept.
The Danger Room is so cool.
It is one of the big X-Men things alongside Sentinels.
Yeah.
That is like one of the things that people really know about X-Men that doesn't come into the movies for a long time. David Hayter got the script credit for his draft. There had been, as I mentioned, like 20 plus drafts of this script going around. Bryan Singer and the producer Tom DeSanto got story credit for it. Some of the more recent drafts were by Ed Solomon and by Christopher McQuarrie, who at that point had written The Usual Suspects, goes on to write and direct the latter-day Mission Impossible movies.
Okay.
Basically anything. His job now is like making good movies for Tom Cruise. Like anything in the last 10 years that has been excellent that Tom Cruise was also in is like all thanks to Christopher McQuarrie.
Okay.
Both of those guys turned down having their name. They said like, do you want screenplay credit? So it would have been like Christopher McQuarrie and Ed Solomon and David Hayter, and they both turned it down. Hayter has said publicly that the movie is based on 55% of his script. Wow. Which, if that's what he's saying, rumors have suggested that it is much, 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 much less.
Okay.
The one report that I found said that the draft is mostly McQuarrie's.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, that makes it to the final stage. There's no way of us knowing at that point. But Bryan Singer had one man in his mind to play Wolverine, and it was Russell Crowe.
Who that same year was busy winning the Oscar for Gladiator, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So Russell Crowe said, hey, I don't think it's right for me, but you should check out my friend. His name's Hugh Jackman. I think you'll like him. Singer said, no way in hell I'm not going to cast an unknown to play Wolverine.
Right.
So he turned him down and he cast Dougray Scott, who was busy being in the aforementioned highest grossing movie of the year, Mission Impossible 2, as the bad guy. So he had some scheduling conflicts with Mission Impossible 2. And also in the middle of this, right as they're like shooting, gets in a motorcycle accident.
Oh, geez.
Doesn't die, but just like can't do the movie.
Right.
So then, that not even then do we get to Hugh Jackman. Then they say, please, Glenn Danzig, lead singer of the punk rock band Danzig, will you come in and play Wolverine? And he said, sorry, I'm on tour. Then 3 weeks into filming, they bring on Hugh Jackman. Yeah, I know.
Oh
I know.
God.
Everyone at home, look up what Glenn Danzig looks like.
Oh.
And then imagine him. Which, again, is like not entirely far off from what Wolverine looks like in the comics.
Well, true, because he's not so much... He's also not a romantic lead in the comics.
Yeah.
I mean, he is having an affair with Jean Grey through a lot of the comics.
Uh-huh.
But I think, like, Scott's the pretty boy. Like, Scott is the one who you're supposed to think, like, Cyclops is the one who's, like, hot.
Those other roles also all went through, like, so many iterations of cast members. Angela Bassett, even now, 10 years later, was still the first pick for Storm.
Wow.
But was too expensive for the movie. Natalie Portman turned down Rogue, as did a lot of other actresses at the time. The filming was supposed to start in mid-1999, like in the summer, and then it got pushed back to the very end of the year. At the same time as the release date of the film got pushed up, because this movie was supposed to come out Christmas 2000, and then because of Steven Spielberg's Minority Report changing its release date, this movie got moved to July.
They just, like, telescoped it in.
Yeah. The filming got pushed way back, and the release date got pushed way forward.
Damn.
So they made this movie in, like, about 9 months.
Good Lord.
Which is crazy looking at it.
That is crazy.
I mean, a lot of it holds up decently. There's no, like, limit to stuff that doesn't, but a lot of it looks pretty good for 2000.
Yeah, for
when
sure.
When you think about those other movies we mentioned, when you think about, like, The Matrix and Star Wars Episode 1 the year before, being the two other benchmarks of, like, CGI.
For sure.
I think some of this is to Singer's credit that he wanted the film to be, like, a little more practical. I know specifically I read that he didn't want there to be any licensed music in it because he didn't want to date it. He wanted it to feel like a timeless movie.
That's pretty smart because it does, like, there's nothing looking at it necessarily where you're like, oh, that's definitely...
I think the fashion.
Yeah, the fashion is a little...
But beyond that, yeah. So this part I'm just going to read verbatim. During production, Singer would allegedly arrive late and experience mood swings and explosive tantrums. At the time, Singer claimed to be taking medication for back pain. Cast and crew members found Singer's drug use to be, quote, problematic. Kevin Feige, the film's associate producer, was flown on set to ensure that Singer was kept in line. Singer was also accused of giving small roles to younger actors and minors in exchange for sex.
Jesus.
End quote. So, a turbulent process being made. Kevin Feige is the guy who does all the MCU films. He's like the guy who works his way to the top. Yeah.
Okay.
He's like the man who handles everything for those.
Wow.
And was like an associate producer
Wow.
running around and trying to keep Bryan Singer's drug use in track on this film.
He's the one holding this guy's hair while he pukes in the toilet. I guess that's the way you get to the top of the game, right?
And what's crazy is that like this was going on back then, and then in 2019, this is the same thing with Bohemian Rhapsody, where he's like showing up late, he's on drugs, he's having like all these allegations against him, and like
2019.
Yeah, still for that long. He was still getting these gigs on these high-profile movies. I mean, I'm sure part of it is because of like how successful this movie is.
Yeah.
But it sounds like this is one of the cases where the product is not necessarily indicative of the process they went through to make it.
Yeah.
Certainly on the directorial side. Rebecca Romijn Stamos, who plays Mystique, had 110 silicone pieces glued to her body on top of an entirely opaque paint. She basically stood there naked. They painted her entire body and then glued on 110 pieces to her body. It said it took over 8 hours a day.
Good God.
Every single day she filmed. They also filmed this movie in Canada in the middle of the winter. So she talks about being like naked in the Toronto winter.
Jesus.
A direct quote from her. I had almost no contact with the rest of the cast. It was like I was making a different movie from everyone else. It was hell.
Damn. Did she come back to do the next two?
Yeah, she does do the next two.
She has the Mystique for the next two.
Uh-huh.
Wow. You know, like, I don't know who else had this, but I certainly was like, as a kid, I was like, wow, that's the most beautiful woman ever. It does not matter that she is blue and has scales. She's the most beautiful woman I've ever seen.
That is not,
but maybe that is
not surprising to me.
Maybe that is exclusive to me.
This movie was generally well liked at the time it came out. It wasn't like acclaimed, but it was generally well liked. There was a lot of excitement for the sequel. Like, most people who liked it were like, the sequel is probably going to get better, and that seemed to be also like the people who disliked it were like, it had to do a lot of busy work, but I think the sequel will be good.
I noticed at the end that they are like prepping the sequel pretty hard.
And then I just wanted to read a quote from Roger Ebert's review for the Chicago Sun-Times that I really enjoyed.
All right.
He said, I started out liking this movie while waiting for something really interesting to happen. When nothing did, I still didn't dislike it. I assume the X-Men will further develop their personalities if there is a sequel, and maybe find time to get involved in a story. No doubt fans of the comics will understand subtle allusions and fine points of their behavior. They should linger in the lobby after each screening to answer discussions.
That's good.
Which I thought was pretty funny. And, like, I would say generally pretty close to where I feel about it. Like, I don't dislike this movie, but I think that there's not as much there as there should be for it to, like, really sing, you know?
Okay. I think we're also just, like, spoiled by the Marvel movie, or like the Marvel cinematic movies, because they throw everything at it, and it's like there's so many things going on, and there's like so much story happening that when we get a superhero movie that is, when you go back and watch a superhero movie that is not that, it feels like, oh, where's the juice?
Yeah, there really is like such total escalation, because it's even now easy to forget that it was like such a bold move in 2014 for Marvel to have enough trust in its audience to be like, they'll get the Guardians of the Galaxy. To be like, it's a walking tree, it's a talking raccoon, it's in space, it's not like the other things, but like, they'll get it. We don't need to change everything about it. We can do it how it is, and like, the audience will follow us.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So I think that now, because we've had like so long of the filmmakers trusting the audience to get the source material as it is and not changing it for them, that then going back, it's easier to be a little harsher on it.
Yeah.
Then maybe, you know, like if in 2000 we had Guardians of the Galaxy, would people have reacted to it the same way? I don't know.
You would have had Vin Diesel in a tree suit playing Groot. We like to ask the question, who's the protagonist, and what do they want? And that kind of helps us get a good key into like what the overall plot is and how the storytelling is in this movie, how clear the storytelling is. That's a big part of why we're doing this podcast in general, is to examine the clarity of storytelling in the individual iterations throughout the series. And I think the question of who's the protagonist, what do they want, how do they go about getting it, is the most important thing in terms of clarity of story.
I have a take on this.
Okay.
I think that the protagonist is Wolverine.
Okay.
Which we agreed to earlier. And I think that what he wants is to take care of Rogue.
Oh, okay.
I think that he has like kind of a shockingly small amount of agency for a main character, because we meet Rogue first.
Right.
We only meet Wolverine because he runs into Rogue.
Right.
It's really unclear what Wolverine wants for most of this.
Sure.
Because he doesn't know up front about his history,
right,
which becomes his driving force at the end. He doesn't seem to be like unhappy with his life as it is at the beginning.
Sure.
Rogue is like freaked out by it, but we don't hear that Wolverine is like weirded out by anything. So I think that his role in this movie is directly tied to Rogue.
Sure.
And I think that also like that's why he has permission at the end once he has kind of gotten to someplace bigger to go off and do something else, is like all tied into that last scene between him and Rogue where he kind of knows that she's safe.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was thinking about it because at the beginning I have this note that says this is going to be a classic reluctant father figure story.
Uh-huh.
But really he takes to that role pretty quickly. He like cares pretty deeply about her pretty early on. He's like worried about her. He's like, as soon as he wakes up in the mansion after they like have the interaction with Sabretooth early on and the X-Men rescue him, when he wakes up in the mansion, like the number one thing after he's like is over his own freak out is like, where's she at? What have you done with Rogue? And he keeps coming back to it. He goes after her to the train station. He feels like it's his responsibility. So I feel like my initial thought that this was going to be one of those, you know, like a Dr. Grant reluctant father narrative is not right. You know, what do you think about that?
Yeah,
like,
I agree for sure. I think that part where he like wakes up and asks for her, I think all of that is tied into why the movie is about their relationship specifically. I also think about like the train scene, which I think is really good between the two of them, where he as someone who is like very against organizations.
Right.
There's also kind of an interesting thing about him as like a centrist, which they get into for a moment here, where he's like, you guys are just going to kill yourselves in your war. And then Storm is like, well, we have a side.
Yeah.
Like we have picked a side. We're not just running in the middle.
Uh-huh.
There's that, which is interesting going on. But I think that like his primary focus seems to be on Rogue and taking care of her.
Yeah.
I think the movie is also really willing to dig into relationships that are a little uncomfortable or just that we don't see depicted as much. I think something that struck me watching it this time was like the relationship between Jean Grey and Professor X.
Oh, yeah.
Just as kind of like Wolverine makes that weird comment about them where Professor X is like, I teach Jean Grey, and he's like, I bet you do. And then there's that moment when he wakes up, when Professor X wakes up with Jean Grey, and he's like, I knew I'd be okay. You have you to take care of me.
Yeah. That's, I believe, a holdover from the early comics where Professor X has a major crush on his student, Jean Grey, and doesn't want to reveal it to her for several different reasons. Probably at least one of those being that he is her professor. That is like an interesting thing. Like Scott is not very secure in that relationship. Cyclops does not feel like they are not just like a couple in that they are sleeping together. They are literally, they share a room in their quarters so they are like what should feel like a steady, like strong couple. But it never feels that way from any of the interaction there. He's like very much possessive of her, but she doesn't ever, we never really see her even reciprocate to Scott, other than that she is like tentative about flirting with Wolverine because
there's that dynamic. There's also like Wolverine as a father figure for Rogue, but then we also see at the end that she has kind of like a crush on him. Professor X and Magneto's like friendship turned rivalry. Yeah. So I think that this movie is like really interested in at least setting up those like strange relationships. I don't know how much it delves into them, like into really exploring them, but it's happy to put them on screen.
Yeah. It's even interesting in that thing where like it starts with like the Wolverine and Cyclops relationship starts as directly confrontational.
Yeah, he calls Cyclops a dick, and I think that James Marsden does a really good job in the role, and I think the dynamic is juicy.
Yeah.
I wish that we saw Cyclops not as a dick, because he is like the leader of the team for most of the X-Men runs.
Yeah.
And he is much more of kind of like I think his characterization is much closer to a Captain America. He's kind of like,
yes,
he's like a model student. Like,
yeah, that's true.
Kind of. And I actually read a quote when I was doing this that Marsden said he was like really inspired by Boy Scouts, which I think is a good thing for Cyclops, but I'm not sure how much that reads.
Oh, no, that totally reads to me. And if you don't think that the kind of person who would make it to Eagle Scout would be a total dick to a person like Wolverine,
okay, that's fair.
then I think you're wrong.
One of the strongest things going for this movie, and something that I took away from it like a lot watching it this time, is just that like the whole thing is a gigantic queer metaphor.
Yes.
Obviously, that's what Bryan Singer, as self-described bisexual man, was like his first connection to the piece. Ian McKellen, also a gay man, which was his connection to the piece. So it makes sense that that's what they're going for. But I think that is like all over this movie. I mean, especially I think in terms of like the queer family dynamics, like that you're like making a family out of the people around you, that you're okay with finding these like roles that are different from the nuclear family, but are still like the people that you live with. Like the fact that all of these people live in a house together with all of their kind.
Yeah.
The fact of like those dynamics that we were getting into, which are like kind of strange. I think that all of that ties into this metaphor, which is like fundamental throughout the film.
So to get into that a little bit more, to get into like kind of the catalyzing incident in this film, I would say it's probably Robert Kelly, the senator, who comes out with this list of names of mutants who are living among us. And he's trying to incite a moral panic over the mutants. They know, so that in this world, some humans have evolved a mutant gene that can give them all kinds of different powers. Obviously, we see that all across the X-Men, but it's important to note there are tons and tons of people who are just living in the world as mutants. It's not really clear how many of those people know there are other people like them. It's not really clear like how much communication there is between other groups of mutants besides Charles Xavier's students and Magneto's Brotherhood of Mutants. And also Magneto's Brotherhood of Mutants seems to be just him and 3 other mutants. So that's a little strange.
Yeah, let's sorry to interrupt you. Yeah. Let's count them off. You've got Magneto, who is great in this.
Ian McKellen slays in this film.
His voice, incredible.
It's perfect.
This red velvety puffy shirt they gave him was great.
And the gray sweater with like the weird military things on the shoulders are really cool too. It's like not military, but it kind of is reminiscent of it. It's very cool.
Then you've got Sabretooth, whose thing is like being big
and very hard to kill.
Yes, he gets stabbed like
a lot of times.
9 times through his body by Wolverine and still makes it.
And zapped by Cyclops at least a couple times.
At the end, there's like a little news clip that's talking about one of the aides that was killed by Sabretooth, where they say that he was mauled by a bear.
Yeah, he's got these nasty fingernails that look like bear claws.
Yeah.
And then we've got, Toad?
Toad, played by Ray Park, who also played Darth Maul, who also just this year had an alleged sex scandal. So, that's just going to be all over these old movies that we talk about, who apparently cannot say a line.
He has maybe 2 lines in the whole movie.
He has 3 lines as Darth Maul, and they give them all to Peter Serafinowicz because he can't even say 3 lines. And then in this, there are so many times, and instead, it's like even instead of saying lines, because you can tell that there are like big action moments where he should say a one-liner. And instead of that, he like does little dances.
Or like makes a face.
Or like sticks his tongue out or something.
Yeah, it's strange.
Yeah, very strange. And then you have Mystique.
Incredible. Love it, but she also doesn't like talk very much in this movie.
Yeah, I think the Mystique Magneto dynamic is another like part of this queer dynamic.
Yeah.
Also, just like the idea of Mystique, the idea of her turning into anyone.
Yeah, is inherently has some interesting connotations because she predominantly changes into men in this movie.
I would say this movie has a Mystique problem. In that, in like the last half, I was like, everyone's Mystique. Like, when someone would do something, I would be like, you can't trust them. They're probably Mystique.
Yeah.
For every single character.
Oh,
so it's good to
interesting.
know that that's here in this series from the beginning.
Yeah.
Because that's definitely something that stays in this series.
Yeah, that does happen later on.
There's a similar thing in Mission Impossible where they can, like, make masks of people's faces. So then they just, like, there are all the times where a character will do something in Mission Impossible and then take off their face and it's really another character.
Oh, wow.
Which is the exact same thing. But that was, like, I would say an issue for me in this movie.
Robert Kelly is a senator. He is anti-mutant. He's come out with a list of mutants who are living amongst us, and he is trying to pass a bill that is going to make the mutants register them, like make the mutants come forward and be registered. And Magneto, of course, very against this bill, but so is Xavier. They both see this as an infringement on mutant rights. Magneto sees this as leading towards genocide, and we should talk about the first scene of the movie in regards to this, because Magneto himself is a survivor of the Holocaust, and it is made frequent. I mean, it's made reference to a couple different times, but the opening scene of this movie is, I think, maybe like the most like gut-wrenching scene of the whole movie. Is the scene where young Magneto is torn away from his mother at the entrance to a concentration camp in Poland, and as he's being pulled away, his mutant ability comes out for the first time, and he pulls this giant metal gate into basically a pretzel before a German soldier smacks him in the head with a rifle. It is a brutal scene to open the movie with. When I watched it this time, I mean, when I watched it as a kid, I didn't have anywhere near as much, like Holocaust history awareness. This time watching it was like pretty like difficult to watch. I think it sets the tone in a really weird place at the beginning of the movie. It's like a really dark scene, and then you just cut away from it.
Did it feel flippant for you? Would the cut from that to like the Rogue makeout scene?
Not necessarily, but it is strange. It is just like a tonally hard thing to open with and then go somewhere so completely different.
A hard sell, but I think in the first 10 minutes of this movie, you have really clearly laid out like the two X-Men metaphors. Like that one of them is that it's a metaphor for minorities. And then you have that it's a metaphor for puberty.
Right.
Which is the other big X-Men metaphor.
Yeah.
That this is kind of like a high school, and that it's kind of all these like tantrums and explosions of power are normally like from hitting puberty, from these first like big moments of not knowing how to handle your emotions and handle your body, and all of those things are like exemplified by the X-Men. We get that in the scene where Rogue has what she says is her first kiss with this boy in some southern state. I don't know.
I believe she's from Mississippi.
So talk about another actress who's kind of shackled by the accent here. I think Anna Paquin is really held back by that.
I also just like a funny thing from this scene. She doesn't know where Niagara Falls is. Because when she's pointing on the map, she's like, we're going to go to Niagara Falls. And she's pointing at North Dakota.
Also, not long after the scene, we get the scene of like the bar, which is in Canada. A lot of this movie is, the whole movie was filmed in Canada. A lot of this movie is very Canadian in feel, I would say. And there is that thing of like being like, can one of the people come and defeat this guy?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think in that, and just like all the different ways that it shows how misunderstood the X-Men are, just like mutants are by the rest of the public. How there is kind of like this lack of leaders and a lack of an older generation, I think is really clear. I also think that it like so pitch perfectly gets the power fantasy of revenge in this, that like the power fantasy is not killing your oppressor. Right. It is making your oppressor become you. Yeah. Which I think is like so profound in this, that like the worst thing they could do to these people who are like voting to oppose them and live in fear of them is just to like make them live in the world they created as them.
Make them live like they do. Yeah, and Magneto doesn't know at the end of the movie that the plan that he's about to enact would kill everybody. Yeah. He really does. He firmly believes that it's just going to make them all like him, and he says, even to the senator, he says, "Welcome to our side, brother," or something like that. When he does the first mutation change on Senator Kelly.
And he says, "You don't have to be afraid of me, not anymore," because he's a mutant now. He wouldn't hurt a mutant.
Yeah.
I was interested in how Professor X would have felt about the plan if it was not that everyone was going to die. Like, if it was that all of the world leaders would become mutants.
Mm-hmm.
Because we know he doesn't trust Magneto, but most of the reaction we get is to once he figures out that everyone's going to die. I think the movie skirts that question. I think like it may very well be intentional that they. I think it also skirts the question of where Professor X stands on the Mutant Registration Act. He obviously cares about it deeply. Mm-hmm. He's there watching it, but like, is he for it? Because Magneto is against it? Because he says some things that like sound like he could be. He's clearly not gung-ho about it.
Right. Well, I think Charles says Eric says it's going to end he thinks it's going to end in genocide. He thinks it's going to end with people being branded with some sort of government number and locked in camps.
Mm-hmm.
And Charles says humanity has evolved since then. And Magneto says, yes, into us.
Yeah, I think the two scenes between those leaders that bookend the movie are really powerful.
Yeah.
And like some of the best writing in this movie, for sure.
Absolutely.
I'm not holding this movie accountable for the movies that come after it, but it is like such a trope that the most powerful character has to get like taken out of the playing field in a way that's just frustrating. Yeah. Like, because Professor X could solve that third act if he was there, so they like have to take him out. Right. Which at least in this is like lampshaded into being part of the villain's plan, is like stated as like Mystique knows that he could solve it, so they purposefully do get rid of him. Sure. But it's like, you don't always have to take Superman out of the team movie. You don't always have to take Captain Marvel out.
Right.
Like, just because they're so much more powerful than everyone else doesn't mean you can't write something for them to do. Right. That's not they get sidelined for the entire third act so everyone else can save it on a human level. The superhero movie can mean a movie like adapted from a superhero comic, a movie featuring superheroes.
Right.
There is also like a genre of movie.
Right. That
is superhero movie.
Right.
That is what this movie is. And is kind of what a lot of movies we got were until about 2014, 2015.
A lot of just movies?
A lot of movies adapted from comics. Oh. Like, this movie has a ton of the tropes of that, and even sets the framework for some of them.
Right.
Like, that there's always a device that's on the rooftop of a thing that's going to hurt innocent people, that the heroes have to stop, that the team always has to learn how to work together, that a superhero always has to fight a superhero that has the same exact powers as them, not like learn how to do any other powers.
Right.
That the most powerful character gets taken off the table. Like, there are all these things that we see time and time again, which are like superhero movie as a genre, which goes back to, I think when Dark Knight came out, everyone was like, oh, this was so good. What does it mean? It means that audiences want dark and gritty movies. It means that all movies have to be dark and grounded and gritty.
Yeah.
Where I think that like the lesson they should have taken, and they do eventually take, is that like audiences want to see their superheroes in different genres. Like, Dark Knight is a crime thriller, featuring Batman, and I think that is what like is the thing that ensures the Marvel Studios film's success and longevity. Eventually, is when they're like, oh, we're going to have space fantasies. We're going to have rom-coms.
Right. We're going to have whatever Thor Ragnarok is.
Yeah, we're going to have comedies. We're going to have political thrillers.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to put these characters inside of other genres. And that's what, like, keeps it fresh. And I think that this movie, which, again, is, like, very much, like the starting point of a lot of these things, is just, like, through and through sticks to the genre. Even in, like, the first two acts where you're kind of, like, clearly, like, a smaller scale version of those things. But then when you get to the third act, it's like, okay, well, now we got to have half an hour of punching because it's a superhero movie.
Right. It does have a lot of punching at the end. It does have a lot of very slow, very bad punching and weird acrobatics to get to the punching.
How do you feel about Hugh Jackman in this? This is his first major film role. This is the third film he's been in, but the first like major motion picture.
I like him. I think something that gets ignored about Hugh Jackman is that he's a good actor.
Yeah.
And I think the X-Men movies are partially to blame for that. But I mean, he's an incredible actor. And he was a stage actor, like an incredible Broadway stage actor before he was in this movie even. Like, he's not taking it so seriously that it's like boring. He's not pretending he's in an indie film. Like, he knows he's in a superhero movie and he's having fun with it, but it still feels grounded, and his relationship with Rogue feels real. And I think the one part of it that I don't like is at the very end when he like wakes up and has like that scene with Jean Grey at the end. I think that's a little forced. But I think that's also kind of the writing.
Yeah, I actually think that his warm energy smooths over a lot of the rough edges of that character. I think on the page, and if you listen to what he's saying, particularly in those very like macho back and forth with Jean Grey, like if you listen to that, you're like, oh, this dude's a creep. Like, this dude is a jerk. But I think that he just has such a warm energy that it's smoothing over a lot of that stuff and making it go down easier. I do really like him in here. I think we do see a little bit of his ballet training throughout it. Yeah. And I agree. I think that he is... it's not a hot take to say that he's a good actor, but I think that like he's a great actor as Wolverine. And then so they're like, okay, let's give him 10 Wolverine movies. And then like eventually he's like, oh, I can do something else too. I can also be in musicals. And then they're like, oh my gosh, let's give him 8 musicals. And then I feel like just this year with Bad Education, one of my favorite films of the year, I think he gives like a career high performance. And I hope that now people are like, oh, he can act as these dramatic characters. Let's give him all of these. It feels like he has to keep showing us his skills.
For real.
And then like finally people are like, oh my gosh, yes.
I really hope that like all of the bodybuilding for X-Men didn't shorten his lifespan considerably, because I want to see this guy like acting in movies for the next 30 years. You know, like I want to see him as a craggly old guy. I think also I would be remiss if we didn't mention one of my favorite movies, Australia, starring him and Nicole Kidman, directed by the Artur director Baz Luhrmann.
Okay, for those counting at home, that is this week's reference of Australia. Please spot where you can find it next week.
Okay.
Any other cast members you want to talk about? We've already talked about...
I want to talk about Halle Berry.
Oh, yeah.
I want to talk about the fact that why did you get Halle Berry if you weren't going to give her any damn lines?
Halle Berry, who the year after this, 2001, wins Best Actress at the Academy Awards for Monsters Ball. Side note, the only woman of color to have ever won Best Actress.
Jesus
in nigh 100 years. The only woman of color who has ever been the Best Actress, the only person who wasn't a white woman who was ever the Best Actress, is Halle Berry, who they get to play this role that we were saying was like the lead.
The lead. It should be the
female lead.
I mean, supposedly it's supposed to be her and Wolverine as the two leads in this, and she is at least as absent from this movie as the other two, as Scott and Jean Grey are, but really even more so because she doesn't talk for the whole first half.
Yeah, we certainly get like a strong visual sense of who she is, but don't get much sense of her personality at all.
I mean, I think we get the idea that she's a badass. We love that. Like, we love the fact that Storm is totally badass and seems like secretly more powerful than either Scott or Jean Grey. Like, as far as like skill in fighting,
it is like the big moment is when she gets to flex and like bring out the whole. Yeah. She like zaps
the weather
Toad,
control. Yeah, and like gets him good. But she really doesn't. Yeah, she doesn't have like a lot to do in this movie other than like come in and save people's bacon. She has the one scene with the senator, which could kind of be good if it was longer, where she talks about like sometimes she does hate normal people, or maybe she fears them. But that's over pretty quickly. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting scene. I think there's like the interesting like metatextuality of like, yes, we're talking about the mutants here, but she's also like a black woman talking to a white man about this same thing of like, and the power structures there.
Yeah.
I think structurally there's more to be mined than there is in the writing of that scene. I would say, like the dialogue writing. Yeah.
There certainly is like a criticism of these movies too, that Bryan Singer is like so eloquent and thorough with the queer metaphor, but maybe doesn't engage with the material much deeper than that. Some stuff gets underserved because he's primarily interested in that metaphor. I also just want to give a shout out to Shawn Ashmore as Bobby Drake, a character who actually is gay in the comics, but I don't think was at this point. I think he's really likable. I think he's really cute. He doesn't have a lot to do, but it's clear that he was kind of like, he's someone who I think, along with what you were talking about with Hugh Jackman, like gets the tone.
Yeah.
A little bit better than some of the other characters.
And his stuff, he's important. He's like more important as like what his relationship to Rogue is too. It's like, he's the one who's like welcoming Rogue in. And at the end we like see them. We know that there's the spark of some sort of romance is going on with them.
So this is a segment we're going to do for each of these movies. Who is your MVP of this movie who's not Wolverine? Because Wolverine is going to be the best character in most of these movies. So who is it?
I would have to say Magneto.
Oh yeah, he's excellent.
I would say like the acting is incredible. I think he's another one who like nails the tone. Like he's big and campy, but it like seems like it could be part of his character, like that he is like kind of a show off, and that like part of being Magneto and part of like being part of the Mutant Brotherhood is like loving your powers, like being in your powers and being proud of your powers and like flaunting it to the world and saying like, yeah, like if the rest of the world can't deal with it, then I'll kill them. Like it is like, it's awesome. How about you? What would you say your MVP other than Wolverine is?
Mine actually is a character I don't think we've talked about much. It's Famke Janssen as Jean Grey.
Okay.
Who I think does great work in this movie.
All right, speak to it.
And I think that like that's a role. I mean, she is probably the main female character of this movie. She's defined by her relationship to 3 different men. That is like her primary thing. This movie also doesn't come anywhere close to passing the Bechdel test.
No, it does not.
I guess Rogue is the primary female character of this movie.
Sure.
But I think that she has Jean Grey has such like a simmering energy throughout all these scenes. I think she plays her relationship with these 3 men like so differently with each of them, with the Professor and Cyclops and Wolverine. I think the chemistry between her and Hugh Jackman is really good. I think it helps that they're kind of like age appropriate too, which is rare in Hollywood. Yeah, I love the use of her powers we get to see. I feel like they do some inventive uses in the end. I feel like the moment where she goes in and takes over Cerebro. Okay, I couldn't remember if that was the plane or the thing. When she goes in and like Cyclops is taking her and she does the sacrifice. Like I think that all of that stuff is really cool. I think you are also keeping track of the body count.
Yes, so I thought it would be interesting to see like your mom said about the content in these films, how violent they are, tracking that. We have in this movie, I counted 6 deaths.
Okay.
That includes some dead bodies of guards that we see. So like only 3 important people die in this movie. And that would be Robert Kelly, who like gets liquefied in like the most like a pretty gruesome death.
Yeah.
Definitely the most gruesome death in this movie. And then both Toad and Sabretooth die in the final battle. Toad gets struck by lightning and like flies off into the East River, and Sabretooth gets similarly, I think, stabbed repeatedly zapped with a blast by Cyclops, and then falls into a boat and explodes.
Okay, any last thoughts? Anything else that we've neglected? We want to talk about X-Men 2000.
Okay, let's see.
Kitty Pryde we see for a second. She's a big character in the comics. She's one of my favorite X-Men from the little bit that I have read. She is just in the classroom and then she walks through the wall. There's also a reference that could be to her earlier of a girl in Illinois who walks through walls.
Yeah. Important to note that in the comics, the same relationship that Rogue and Wolverine have in this movie is really the Kitty Pryde-Logan relationship from the comics.
Yeah. Also, the era of comics that I've read, I know this stuff changes all the time, is that Rogue's main romance is with Gambit, and Kitty Pryde's main romance was with Iceman before he came out, obviously. I think he was actually outed by Kitty Pryde in the comics a few years ago.
Kitty Pryde also, in some versions of the comics, has a major thing for Colossus, who we won't see. We'll see briefly.
They got married recently.
Okay.
I know Colossus married someone recently. I think it was him and Kitty Pryde.
That's awesome. I love that for her. She's one of my favorite characters.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, there's a Jaws homage in the scene where Senator Kelly rolls up on the beach, which I think is pretty cool. There's a kid in a little yellow floaty raft that looks a lot like the raft that the kid is on in Jaws when he gets eaten. I love a single tear, and Rogue has a single tear. Oh, we've got Logan saying bub, which is great. It's something he says a lot in the
chewing
comics.
on the cigar all the time.
And chewing on the cigar, which are two things from the comics that are good.
An interesting thing is, I don't know if you know this, that you can't see him light the cigar and smoke it, or it's an automatic R rating.
Really?
Which is why in a lot of these movies he'll be like puffing on the cigar, but you won't see him light it. Or like sometimes it'll get lit, but then he won't smoke it. You can't have like both of them. That's one of those
either
things.
Or in a single different scenes, but weird.
That's one of those things, I think later on, because there's actually a reference in this. Well, actually in a really funny gag, maybe that's how they got away with it. It's also a thing that you can't have like a guy driving without a seatbelt, or it's an automatic R rating. And there's a moment where that happens in this, and then like immediately after he goes through the windshield and dies.
Wow.
Because she says you're not wearing a seatbelt. And he's like, look, you don't need to lecture me. And then they hit Sabretooth. And then he dies and regenerates back to life.
That's incredible. Another thing I would say, another little like snippet for the comics fans, is when they're flying and they're flying out to do the mission, the final mission, and Logan is like making some face about the costume, and Cyclops says, "What would you prefer, yellow spandex?" So that's for the fans of the comics out there.
This is like a big thing. We're not going to get all the way into it now, but this is one of the several things that I think this movie like casts onto other things, is that you can't be comics accurate, that everyone has to wear like some form of like dark cool streetwear.
Yeah.
There was a comic going around this summer that was really funny that was like a version of that same scene where they're wearing like the iconic yellow X-Men uniforms, and they hand one to Wolverine, and Cyclops says, "What did you expect, black dominatrix leather?" Oh yeah. I think this movie is deeply resonant still today. I think there's so much strong metaphorical stuff that we talked about and didn't even fully unpack. I do think, however, that's the strongest stuff of the movie, is the subtextual stuff. I think it makes smart narrative choices, but also kind of like some that doom other superhero movies in trying in its wake for years to come. But it's just a really interesting microcosm now of what a movie looked like 20 years ago, 2 whole decades ago.
Yeah.
And I'm interested to see where all we go from here.
Yeah, me too.
So next week we are going to be back. We're going to be talking about a movie that somewhere in the world at this very moment, a man who is 32 years old and is wearing a flannel over a graphic t-shirt is saying is the best superhero movie ever made. We're going to be talking about X2 X-Men United, which I'm really excited for.
Man, I am very excited for this one. It has one of my favorite characters in it.
A full 30 minutes longer than this film.
Sweet Lord Jesus. It is. It's a honker.
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you for listening.
Yeah.
To our first episode.
Yeah, thank you for listening.
And they're going to keep getting better. They're going to keep having a good time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Have an excellent day.
Stay frosted.
Cinema Bums is a production of DKG Podcasts. It is created and produced by Emma Temple and me, Wade Lawrence Holloman. I also edit and mix the podcast. Our theme music is by Zane Holloman, who you can find on Bandcamp, and our show art is by Autumn Beckner. Our social media is managed by Laura Bennett. If you like what you hear, please tell all your friends, and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, the 2 best ways to spread the word about our work. You can also follow us on Instagram @CinemaBums or email us at cinemabumspod@gmail.com. Don't flake on us. We'll be back next week.